What if every kind word, every gentle smile, every moment of concern was part of a strategy, a silent game designed to make you doubt yourself and trust them? Most people believe manipulation looks obvious, loud, aggressive, maybe even violent. But true control doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides in everyday behavior, disguised as care, charm, or love. The most dangerous manipulators don't take your freedom by force. They make you offer it willingly. They build invisible strings, emotional threads that make you dance to their rhythm without ever realizing it. And when you finally notice, it's usually too late. They use psychology, not power. They read your fears, your needs, your empathy, and turn them into tools. Tools to control your mind, shape your emotions, and rewrite your sense of reality. But here's the part no one tells you. Manipulation isn't just something that happens to you. It's something that's engineered, planned, tested, perfected by people who understand how the human mind bends under pressure. In this video, we'll uncover 10 psychological tricks manipulative people use to control others, the exact methods they rely on to keep you confused, compliant, and emotionally dependent. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. And that's where freedom begins. It never starts with control. It starts with connection. At first, they make you feel seen, like someone finally understands you. They mirror your emotions, your interests, even your pain. You start to believe this is rare, maybe even love. But that feeling, it's the bait. Manipulative people don't dominate by force. They condition. They study your reactions, testing how far they can push before you resist. They compliment you to see how quickly you respond. They criticize you softly just to watch how much guilt you carry. Each moment becomes data, a map of your emotional weak points. Soon their approval becomes addictive. You crave their validation like oxygen because they've carefully trained you to need it. And when they withdraw it, when the warmth suddenly turns cold, you panic. You start chasing their attention, not realizing that this is how they tighten the leash. This is where the trap begins to close. They use confusion as a weapon. When their words and actions don't match, you question yourself instead of them. You start thinking you are the problem, that if you could just be better, they'd go back to how they were before. But that's the illusion. There is no going back, because the person you met at the start, the one who made you feel special, was a mask. A mask designed to gain your trust, to study your patterns, to make sure that when control begins, you won't even notice. And by the time you do, you've already begun to confuse manipulation with love, attention with safety, and obedience with peace. That's how intelligent control works. It doesn't take your power, it convinces you to hand it over. To understand manipulation, you have to understand one thing. It's never random. It's systematic. Every technique is a calculated move, a quiet adjustment in your emotions designed to pull you in deeper. Manipulators don't control you through strength. They control you through psychology. They learn how your mind reacts, how your heart bends, and how your empathy can be weaponized against you. The first thing they attack is your reality. Gaslighting begins small, a simple denial, a twist of memory, a suggestion that you're too sensitive or confused. At first, you defend yourself, but slowly doubt starts to spread. You question your own perception, your memory, even your sanity. And once that seed takes root, you start trusting them more than you trust yourself. That's when they know they have you, because you've surrendered the one thing they needed to break, your certainty. Then comes guilt, one of the most powerful emotional levers. They make you feel responsible for their feelings, for their moods, even for their mistakes. If you say no, they look hurt. If you defend yourself, they act like you're cruel. And because you're kind, because you care, you give in. Every time you apologize for something you didn't do, their control grows. Guilt becomes the invisible chain you willingly wear. But guilt alone doesn't keep people loyal. That's where affection comes in. Love bombing feels intoxicating. The attention, the praise, the sense of being chosen. It feels like you finally found someone who sees you. But that flood of love isn't genuine. It's a setup. They're building emotional credit, preparing for the moment they'll take it away. And when they do, you'll do anything to get it back. You'll chase the version of them that never truly existed. When affection no longer works, silence begins. The silent treatment is one of the coldest forms of psychological punishment. It makes you question your worth. You replay every word, every action, searching for what you did wrong. But you'll never find an answer, because silence is the answer. It's how they remind you that connection is conditional. Speak wrong, act wrong, think wrong, and they'll disappear. You learn to walk on emotional glass, terrified of breaking the fragile piece. Then they bring others into the picture, a friend, an ex, a stranger. They mention them casually, but you feel the shift. Suddenly, you're no longer secure. You're competing. That's triangulation, the art of control through comparison. They create jealousy to make you fight for attention that should have been freely given. They watch, detached, while you lose yourself in a battle that only feeds their ego. When you start noticing inconsistencies, they deflect. They project their behavior onto you. If they lie, they call you dishonest. If they manipulate, they accuse you of control. You spend your energy defending yourself while the real manipulator hides behind your confusion. This is psychological inversion, a mirror they hold up to make sure you never see their reflection, only your own. But the most addictive part comes next, the pattern of reward and punishment. They give you love, then take it away, then give it again. It's unpredictable, and that's exactly why it works. Your brain releases dopamine when they're kind, and you start chasing that high. It's the same principle that keeps gamblers pulling the lever, believing the next pull will change everything. You're not in love, you're addicted. Addicted to inconsistency, to hope, to the fantasy of peace that never lasts. When they sense resistance, they shift again. Suddenly, they're the victim. They twist every situation until they're the ones suffering, and you're the one to blame. Their pain becomes your responsibility. You find yourself comforting them, even when they're the ones who hurt you. You begin to confuse compassion with obligation, and that's exactly how they keep you silent. And then the final layer, control through uncertainty. They decide what you know, what you hear, what you see. They give you fragments of truth small enough to keep you searching, large enough to make you believe. It's mental fog, deliberate confusion. The less clarity you have, the more control they hold. When you can't see clearly, you cling to the only person who seems to understand what's going on, them. But when all these techniques begin to lose power, they turn to fear. Not open threats, emotional ones. The fear of losing them, the fear of being alone, the fear that no one else will ever care the way they do. That's the final leash. The one that keeps you obedient without them ever having to raise their voice. And here's the truth. These 10 methods aren't random acts of cruelty. They're pieces of a system, a cycle that keeps you disoriented, guilty, and desperate for approval. Gaslighting destroys your reality. Guilt breaks your boundaries. Intermittent affection hooks your emotions. And fear seals the door from the inside. You don't even realize it's happening until the day you wake up and realize that your entire sense of self has been rewritten. That's the real power of manipulation. It doesn't control your actions. It controls your perception. And once they own your perception, they own you. Have you ever apologized for something you didn't do, just to keep the peace? Have you ever stayed quiet to avoid starting another argument? Or felt that strange mixture of guilt and relief when the tension finally disappeared, even though you knew it would return? That's what manipulation feels like from the inside. It's not dramatic. It's not always loud. It's a slow erosion of self, the kind that feels like love one day and exhaustion the next. You tell yourself you're being understanding, patient, kind, but deep down you can feel it. A quiet fear growing every time you have to edit yourself just to stay safe. You start to notice patterns. You start censoring your thoughts before you speak. You begin to predict their moods almost instinctively, because that's how you've learned to survive. You watch their tone, their body language, the pauses between their words. You tell yourself you're being attentive, but really you're scanning for danger. And that's when you realize something's wrong. Because healthy connection doesn't require constant self-monitoring. It doesn't make you question your worth every time you express a need. But manipulation trains you to believe that love is something you must earn, that peace only exists when you're compliant, that your emotions are liabilities, weaknesses to be managed rather than truths to be heard. Maybe you've noticed how you start defending them to others. You say things like, they've just been under a lot of stress, or they didn't mean it that way. You create stories to protect them, stories that protect your illusion of safety. Because if you admit what's really happening, everything would have to change. And change, when you've been conditioned to fear conflict, feels like danger. Sometimes you catch glimpses of yourself, the person you used to be, stronger, clearer, freer. But every time you try to reach for that version, the guilt pulls you back. You start wondering if you're the one overreacting, if maybe you are too sensitive. That's what years of psychological conditioning do. They teach you to doubt your own reflection. It's not weakness, it's programming. And the moment you recognize that truth, the moment you realize that confusion, guilt, and fear were designed to keep you in place, something shifts. Awareness begins to dissolve the illusion. You start to see how they move, how they speak, how they twist the narrative. You notice how every compliment has a hook, how every apology has a condition. You start to see through the pattern, and for the first time, you don't react the same way. That's the turning point, because manipulation can only survive in the dark. Once you bring awareness into it, the entire system begins to lose its power. Freedom doesn't start when you leave the manipulator. It starts when you see the game. The first rule of psychological defense is awareness. You cannot fight what you don't understand. And now you do. Once you recognize manipulation for what it is, a system, not a story, the spell begins to break. You start to detach emotionally. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop reacting to every provocation, every guilt trip, every silence, because you realize that's the fuel they need to keep control alive. The moment you stop feeding the game, it collapses. That's not just strategy, it's psychology. Manipulators need your emotional engagement to maintain dominance. Indifference starves them. Clarity disarms them. The second rule is emotional distance. You can love someone and still protect your mind from them. Emotional distance doesn't mean coldness. It means observation. You start watching instead of absorbing, listening instead of reacting. You study their patterns the way they once studied yours. And when you stop giving them emotional data, they lose their map. Then comes the hardest part, rebuilding boundaries. Boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They protect what's sacred without closing you off from what's real. A boundary is simply the sentence, "This is what I will no longer accept." It doesn't need explanation, validation, or apology. You're not cruel for saying no. You're healthy. You also begin to redefine respect. Respect isn't how others treat you. It's how you treat yourself when they don't. Every time you choose silence over reaction, every time you step away instead of explaining your worth, you reclaim power. It's quiet, invisible power, but it grows with every act of restraint. And then something deeper happens. The confusion fades. The constant tension inside your body starts to dissolve. You begin to breathe again. Not the shallow survival breaths you've grown used to, but full, grounding ones. You start to feel your own thoughts again, unfiltered by someone else's judgment. That's not just healing, that's reprogramming. Because manipulation is mental conditioning, and awareness is the antidote. The more you see through it, the less it can touch you. You stop personalizing other people's behavior. You realize their need for control was never about your flaws. It was about their fear of losing power. You understand now, people who manipulate are not strong. They're terrified. Control is their armor against emptiness. Dominance is their disguise for insecurity. And the moment you see that truth clearly, something powerful happens. Not revenge, not hatred, but emotional freedom. You stop needing closure from those who profit from confusion. You stop explaining your pain to people who feed on it. You simply let go. And in that silence, in the same silence they once used to punish you, you find peace. When you look back, it almost feels unreal. How something so quiet could have such power. How simple words, pauses, and gestures could rearrange your entire sense of self. But that's the nature of manipulation. It doesn't break you loudly. It bends you gently until you forget what straight ever felt like. The truth is, control never begins with cruelty. It begins with understanding. They studied you. They learned your hopes, your fears, your empathy, and they turned them into instruments. But what they never expected was that you would learn too. Because once you see through manipulation, it can't reach you the same way again. You begin to recognize the tone shifts, the subtle guilt traps, the hidden motives in people's words. You stop reacting emotionally to every attempt at control, and in that stillness, you become unpredictable. They can no longer read you, and that terrifies them. You start to realize that power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from mastering your own awareness, from staying calm in the chaos they create, from knowing that silence, on your terms, is no longer punishment, it's peace. In the end, this isn't about them. It's about reclaiming your mind from the influence of others. It's about choosing clarity over confusion, truth over illusion, and strength over fear. They control through confusion. You win through clarity. And once you see the pattern, you never unsee it. That's the beginning of real freedom, the quiet kind that no one can take away. Protect your mind. Understand their game.